This is the latest release from Redbreast Irish Whiskey, and it is a bit different to their normal whiskies. This week, let me tell you about the Redbreast Tawny Port Cask edition. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm the whiskey nerd, and like I said, this is the Redbreast Tawny Port Cask edition. So let me get it into the glass and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. And this is a brand new release from Redbreast. It was only released a couple of days ago in September, and it is kind of the latest edition in their Iberian series. So the Iberian Peninsula is the Spanish-Portuguese peninsula in Europe, and it's famous for producing a lot of fortified wines like ports, sherries, and things like that. And for the Iberian series, Redbreast are highlighting different kind of wines and fortified spirits you can get from the Iberian Peninsula. For example, the first kind of core release in the Iberian series is the Redbreast Lustau edition, focusing on Oloroso Sherry from the bodegas Lustau. Then they had a limited edition release, the PX Sherry Casks, looking at Pedro Jimenez Sherry, and this one here is the latest edition, looking at port wine, specifically Tawny Port. This is not Redbreast's first kind of foray into port finished whiskies. They have had other releases like Dream Casks or their very kind of top end premium 27-year-old release, which does have port cask inclusion, but this is probably the most accessible version of it. It came out at about $100 or €100, I think about 85 British pounds. So it's definitely the more approachable, easy to find versions, and I have heard that this is still relatively available. Now, it might not be by the time the video comes out, but right now it's still kind of readily available. Some online retailers still have stock. I've heard a few stores have it in stock. The distillery will have it in stock, and I've also heard that some stores, especially the stores outside of Ireland, have yet to get their allocation. So there will be bottles kind of released for the next few months, and there will be kind of relatively available, but it won't be fully available forever because it is a limited edition. And while the whiskey does use Tawny Port as a kind of a finish on the whiskey, it is still noticeably a Redbreast whiskey, which means it is a triple distilled, single pot still Irish whiskey that was aged in bourbon casks, then aged in Oloroso Sherry casks before being finished in those Tawny Port casks. Now, interestingly enough, online and in a few other reviewers or people have seen writing about this whiskey, they say that it was matured in those Tawny Port hogsheads, those casks, for between 14 and 25 months. But that might not actually be true, because if you look at the box, you should always look at the box rather than the marketing kind of press releases. On the back of the box, it says it was matured in those Tawny Port casks for a minimum of 9 months. Now, there could be a couple of different reasons for this. It could have been that they've 20 casks and one of them is really fresh, it's really wet, and when they put the whiskey into it, it immediately started giving huge port influence. So they left it in too long, it would have been overpowering, or it might have even spoiled the whiskey, so they might have had to empty one cask a little earlier than they were initially kind of planning to do it, and then they left the rest of the casks in for between that 14 and 25 month period to get the balance right. But there is a minimum age in that port cask of 9 months rather than that 14 to 25 months you do see kind of quoted in a lot of the press releases. I know that's a little bit of a nitpicky detail to say, actually it was 9 months, not 14 months, but I wouldn't be living up to my name as the whiskey nerd if I didn't go in for those little details and give you as much information as I could about the whiskey itself. And speaking of the whiskey, it is, like I said, an Irish single pot still whiskey, which is the style of whiskey that's unique to Ireland. I won't go into all the technical details, but it has to be a minimum of 30% malted barley, a minimum of 30% unmalted barley, and at most 5% other grains. Now, those rules might change in the future, but right now it is a minimum of 30% malted, minimum of 30% unmalted, and 5% other grains. And this gives distilleries a bit of freedom. They can play around with different mash bills. Some go 50-50, some go 30-70, some go 60-40, some will include other grains like oats or wheat or rye to kind of give a bit of different flavor to the whiskey, but Redbreast is just malted and unmalted barley, and as far as I'm aware, it's a 50-50 split of malted and unmalted barley in those pot stills. In addition to the kind of caramel, biscuity, malty notes you get from the malted barley, unmalted barley gives you a bit of extra spiciness, a bit of extra kind of creamy oiliness on the mouthfeel, maybe a bit of extra citrusy, kind of that kind of note that comes through the whiskey to give it a bit more flavour than you might expect from a whiskey that's down at a lower percentage. But this whiskey here comes in at 46% ABV or 92 proof, so it's nice and strong. It's not so strong it's going to be like overpowering your senses. It's not down to the floor, so you won't get all the flavours. And it's not like a cask strength whiskey where you can really feel what the whiskey's all about. I personally like 46% as it gives you a nice bit of flavour without being overpowering. But speaking of overpowering, speaking of nice flavours, I think it's time we go in for the nose on the Redbreast Tawny Port Cask Edition. Cheers. It is immediately sweet. It is very sweet. It's almost like syrupy sweet. It's very, very dense. There's a lot of caramel going in there. There's not a huge amount of like vanilla notes coming through. Maybe that'll come through later, but at least on the nose, it's definitely sweet. It's syrupy. There's it's almost got a little bit of like a buttery note as well going through. It reminds me of like an almond croissant, you know, where you get that flaky kind of pastry and then you get that sweet almond paste in there. Less of the almond, more of that flaky buttery pastry in there, but definitely like a little bit of that almondy nuttiness coming through. And you also do get a lot of fruit. You get a good amount of fruit coming in out of this whiskey. I mean, the original Redbreast, it's kind of dried fruits. It's dried raisins, it's dried cranberries, that kind of thing. This one though, it's more like juicy fruit. It's plump cranberries, plump raisins, a bit of cherry, a bit of blackberry as well coming through. Definitely more juicy and definitely more fruity, and that's probably that port cask influence coming through. And then rounding it out, I am getting a nice bit of oak and a good bit of citrus coming through, kind of like again that orange peel, but very sweet, not overpowering, not really oaky, not really dry in the nose, but just kind of sweet, fruity notes coming through on the nose. So I think I'm going to go in and we're going to talk about the palate. Cheers. It is rich, it is creamy. There's a lot of like rich oiliness as it hits your palate, very syrupy again, like I was saying on the nose. It kind of spreads out, hits your palate, and really does become a very like full flavored approach on the whiskey. You can tell it's a little bit higher ABV than the standard Redbreast. I'm very familiar with that standard Redbreast, but it does have just that slightly higher ABV to give a bit more weight into the whiskey. There's again that citrus note I was getting on the nose. I'm getting that here, but it's more like a marmalade, you know, like that orange, like an orange jam. It's a marmalade, and you get that sweetness, you get that sugariness, and you still get that citrus coming through. Again, very fruity. Blackberries, cherries, like a dark cherry, like a black cherry, that kind of deeper, darker, almost a bit like a fig as well. With again those really deep, rich, sugary, syrupy fruits, that kind of coming through. I'm getting a little bit of oak as I'm talking, as I'm going over it, but I'm going to go in for a second sip, see what else I can find, see if I can explore that oak and those cask influences a bit. Cheers. Yeah, it's creamy with that kind of caramel, with a bit of toffee note coming through. Definitely a bit of oak spice. Definitely that kind of pot still spice. Like pot still has this characteristic spiciness to it. I wouldn't say this goes as far as like a black pepper. Like some pot still whiskies have this really like freshly cracked black pepper note. This doesn't really have that. It's still peppery, it's still spicy, it's still kind of tingly on the tongue, but it's just a little bit softer than maybe those normal pot still spices you might expect, partly because those sherry casks, the port casks, are just kind of rounding things out, making it a bit more fruity with still that undertone of spice there. And as I'm talking about that spice, as I'm breathing, I'm definitely getting, like, I can definitely taste the finish. It's got a nice kind of warming finish, but I'm gonna go in for a final sip, gonna focus on the finish, see what fades first and what lasts the longest. Cheers. Okay, so on the finish, like you get that creaminess and then that starts to fade. It's not gone, but definitely starts to fade. The citrus note, that starts to fade. I've still got a little bit of that creamy, kind of oily character there. The citrus is gone. The fruity notes are there. Again, it's like that blackberry, black cherry, almost getting a little tart towards the end, and that's probably the combination of that oak spice. The little drying oak spice, as I'm talking, that's lasting the longest. The creaminess is gone. The fruitiness is pretty much all gone, just leaving that oak spice, that oak bite in there into the finish, which is, I'd say, I wouldn't say it's a super long finish, it's definitely on the medium to medium long in the finish. Before I give my final thoughts on the Redbreast Tawny Port Cask Edition, if you're new here, scroll down, hit that thumbs up button, hit that subscribe button. I put out whiskey reviews on Wednesdays, and I put out cocktail recipes featuring whiskey on Friday, so if you want to see more like that, make sure you hit subscribe. But as far as my kind of final thoughts on this whiskey are, it's a lovely whiskey. It is a very, very nice whiskey. Like I said earlier on, when I was writing my notes for this review, I compared it against the standard 12-year-old Redbreast whiskey, and it definitely is very similar, a little bit different, a little bit juicier, a little bit fruitier. Is this a very heavily port finished whiskey? No. And for me, it's almost a little bit of a letdown, because I was really hoping that this would be a very kind of heavy port influence whiskey, because like I said, it's the first kind of accessible, reasonably priced port finished whiskey that I could get my hands on from Redbreast. So I was probably hoping that instead of being a bit of a detour, it would have a much bigger detour. Like it would have a lot more port character coming through into the whiskey. And they did say they didn't want it to be different to standard Redbreast. That's why I went into the bourbon, the sherry, and then finally into the port, to get the port accents without being really heavily port flavored. I think if it was bourbon and then port, much more of that port influence would have come through, much more of those dark red berries would have come through, but then it also probably would have been different to the kind of core flavor profile people expect in a Redbreast. And does that mean it's a bad whiskey? No. Am I going to mark this down as a bad whiskey just because I personally would have liked a bit more port influence? No. Not at all. Why would I do that? Some people love a port influence, like me. Some people think port can be a bit too sweet. So I think it's a lovely whiskey. Like I said, maybe a little bit of a letdown for me because I was really hoping for a port finish whiskey, but it is absolutely lovely. If you can find it, if you like Redbreast whiskies, this is going to be familiar to you. A little bit different, a little bit higher ABV than the standard 12-year-old Redbreast, and just give you a little bit more variety in your Redbreast whiskies. If you're looking for a really heavily port finished whiskey, this one just might not be for you, but it is still a lovely little whiskey. So I'm going to keep on enjoying this very nice little whiskey, and I will see you next time. Sláinte.